My fiancé's brother pulled me aside at the engagement party and said, "You deserve to know who she's really texting." When I read the messages, she tried to blame him. I still remember the noise of that engagement party, the sound of people laughing too loudly over music that didn't fit the mood. I'd spent 2 months planning it, renting a small vineyard outside town with lights strung through the trees. Everyone kept saying how lucky I was to have a woman like Holly. She looked perfect that night, hair pinned up, wine-colored dress catching every bit of light. If anyone glanced at her, they would have seen confidence and charm. But behind all of that, something was already breaking that I couldn't see yet. Halfway through the evening, I went to grab a drink from the bar when her brother, Mason, approached me. He had that expression that says too much before a word comes out. He wasn't smiling. He asked if we could talk privately, away from the music and the crowd. I thought maybe it was about wedding expenses or something harmless. But once we were out by the side terrace, he didn't waste a second. He said I deserved to know who she was really texting. The words came out too casually for what they meant. I laughed at first, thinking he was making some stupid joke or trying to mess with me before giving his blessing. But he didn't laugh. He pulled out his phone, opened his gallery, and scrolled to a series of screenshots. I recognized Holly's number at the top of each one. The messages weren't open to interpretation. They were intimate, suggestive, and too specific to be misunderstood. The name she was texting was Curtis. I kept looking at the phone, waiting for some sign that it was fake. But I knew Mason wasn't the type to fabricate something this serious. He didn't even like drama. He looked angry, not smug, which somehow made it worse. He said he'd found out by accident. Holly had borrowed his laptop to print invitations, and her iCloud was still signed in. He hadn't been looking for dirt, but the messages were there in plain sight, auto-synced. I asked him how long it had been going on. He said months, maybe a year. Some messages talked about travel plans, hotel bookings, meetups when I was away for work. Mason told me he debated whether to tell me, but when he saw me put down a deposit on the venue last week, he couldn't keep quiet. I didn't say much. I just nodded, thanked him for showing me, and told him to act normal for the rest of the evening. I couldn't process it yet. I didn't want anyone noticing anything. Back inside, everything felt unreal. Holly came over, took my arm, smiling like nothing was wrong. The same lips that sent those messages were brushing my cheek. She leaned in, asking if Mason had been his usual awkward self. I just smiled, said he was fine, and kissed her forehead. Every gesture felt like a performance. I spent the rest of the night greeting guests, shaking hands, accepting congratulations from people who had no idea that the entire engagement might already be hollow. When the party ended, I drove us home. Holly was tipsy, humming to herself, scrolling through her phone beside me. I kept glancing at the screen reflection in the windshield. She was typing something fast, deleting, typing again. I couldn't see who it was to. My stomach twisted every time her screen lit up. That night, she fell asleep instantly. I lay awake next to her, staring at the ceiling, replaying Mason's voice in my head. I wanted to believe he misunderstood. I wanted to think there was some explanation. But the tone of those messages, the dates, it was too consistent. And the mention of when he's gone again could only mean me. Around 2 in the morning, I got out of bed quietly and went to her desk. Holly always kept her tablet there for work, synced with her phone. She never logged out. It took less than a minute to find what I was looking for. The same messages Mason had shown me were there. Dozens of them. And more recent ones. Curtis had sent her voice notes. He told her he missed her scent, her laugh. She replied that she couldn't wait to feel normal again with him. The last message from her, sent 2 days before the party, said, "He's busy tonight. I can come by." That line kept repeating in my head. I scrolled further. There were also hotel receipts, one under her name, one under his. Different dates. Always aligning with the nights I'd been working late shifts or traveling for projects. It wasn't anger that hit me first, it was clarity. That kind of cold awareness that wipes away every denial at once. I wasn't losing my mind. Mason was right. But what surprised me most was how methodical she'd been. She had a second email under her maiden name, a separate Venmo handle. Transfers between them labeled as trip fund or dinner share. It wasn't impulsive cheating, it was planned, layered, habitual. I copied every file, screenshot, and message to a flash drive. It wasn't about revenge, I needed to understand the scale. Then I shut the tablet off, went back to bed, and lay there listening to her breathing. She looked peaceful, unbothered, like she'd never had to lie for anything. In the morning, she woke up cheerful, talking about brunch with her bridesmaids. She asked if Mason had behaved weird last night. I told her no, he'd just seemed quiet. She said he'd been distant lately, and probably jealous of our relationship. That line hit me harder than it should have. She'd already built her defense before the confrontation even began. When she left for brunch, I sat on the couch staring at our engagement photos on the wall. I thought about how everyone said we looked perfect. I thought about the day I proposed, how nervous I'd been, how happy she'd looked. All of it felt counterfeit now. Every memory was stained by what I'd seen. I didn't tell anyone, not even Mason, that I'd checked the tablet. I wanted to verify one more thing. I looked up Curtis online. He worked at a marketing firm 2 states away. His social media was filled with gym photos, weekend trips, and lately, a string of captions about missing someone who couldn't choose. That confirmed it. He thought she was single. By afternoon, my whole perception of Holly had changed. She wasn't the person I'd proposed to. She was someone who could compartmentalize, who could smile at me while planning her next trip to another man's city. That evening, Mason texted asking if I was all right. I told him yes, but that I'd talk to him tomorrow. I spent the rest of the night going through every bank transaction, matching them against her travel dates. 3 matched perfectly. She'd paid for flights with our shared card. I'd thought they were for work retreats. It wasn't until midnight that I realized Mason might have been protecting me for longer than he admitted. Maybe he'd suspected her for months, but waited until he had proof strong enough not to be dismissed. And when he finally came forward, it wasn't to gloat. It was because he couldn't stand by anymore. I sat in silence for a long time, staring at the engagement ring box on the table. She had taken it off when she left for brunch earlier and never put it back on. Maybe she didn't even realize. Maybe she didn't care. By the time the sun came up, I knew the next step wasn't to scream or accuse. It was to plan. I wanted her words to betray her, not mine. She'd already woven too many lies. I wasn't going to give her another excuse. When Holly came home the next day, smiling and chatting about centerpieces, I played along. I even kissed her forehead again. But deep down, something inside me had gone quiet. Mason had opened the door. Now I had to walk through it. I knew I'd confront her soon, but not yet. I needed one more piece. Her reaction when she realized I already knew. And when that moment came, she wouldn't be ready. When morning came, I felt detached from everything around me. Holly moved through the apartment humming as she made coffee, as if nothing in the world was wrong. Watching her smile at me from across the counter while my mind replayed the messages made the room feel smaller, air heavier. I didn't plan to say anything that moment. I wanted to hear how she'd respond without knowing what I'd seen. She asked if Mason had said anything strange the night of the party. The question came too quickly, too rehearsed. I told her he'd just congratulated us. She smirked and said he'd always been jealous of how well we fit together. That phrase stuck in my head. It was the same one she'd used in one of the messages to Curtis. It wasn't just coincidence. She was recycling lines. When she left for errands, I checked her tablet again. The chat had new messages from that morning. Curtis was asking if she'd talked to me yet about calling off the engagement. She replied that she'd handle it soon, that she needed time to find the right moment. That was the first time I felt anger rising. Not because she cheated, but because she was planning to discard me like a business arrangement. I printed the full chat thread, every message from start to finish. Then I called Mason and asked to meet in person. We met at a small diner near his workplace. He looked tense when he sat down, but when I told him I'd confirmed everything, he relaxed for the first time. He admitted he'd hesitated to show me sooner because Holly could be manipulative and had turned their parents against him before. He said she once convinced them he'd stolen from her when they were teenagers, just because he'd called her out on something. We went through the evidence together. Mason pulled up a few more transactions that had appeared on her credit card statement. She'd used my joint account for 2 of those trips, but the flight confirmations were sent to an old email she thought was hidden. Mason also had voice notes she'd accidentally sent to their family group chat. Half a second of her laughing before deleting it. The sound matched the timing of one of the hotel stays. I could tell Mason hated every second of this. It wasn't easy exposing his own sister, but he'd made up his mind. He looked at me and said, "If she blames me, don't believe it. She's done it before." I went home with my hands shaking. Not from fear, just from holding everything inside too long. Holly was already back, organizing wedding decor on the table, acting cheerful. I told her we needed to talk. She tilted her head, pretending to be concerned, and asked what about. I placed the printed messages on the table. Her expression didn't change immediately, but I could see the flicker in her eyes before the performance began. She went straight into damage control. She said Mason was obsessed with ruining her life, that he had always hated seeing her happy, that he was unwell and fixated. She claimed the screenshots were fake, that Mason must have photoshopped them to frame her. She looked me dead in the eye and said Curtis was just an acquaintance from work who'd been harassing her. Every word sounded pre-rehearsed, smooth, automatic. I didn't argue. I nodded slowly and told her I'd speak with Mason myself. That threw her off. She didn't expect calmness. She expected shouting, accusations, something she could use later to call me unstable. When she saw I wasn't reacting, she became defensive, then tearful. She tried to hug me, but I stepped back. I said I just needed space to think and left the apartment. Outside, I called Curtis. I found his number through a business listing tied to his firm. He answered with confusion at first, thinking I was a client. When I said my name and mentioned Holly's, silence followed. I could almost hear him processing what that meant. I told him I was her fiancée. He cursed softly under his breath, asked if it was some kind of joke. I told him no, and that I wasn't calling to start a fight. I just wanted to know if he'd been aware she was engaged. Curtis said he had no idea. He thought she'd been single since she left our city. He told me they'd been involved on and off for nearly 2 years, mostly during her work trips. When he heard we were engaged, he sounded disgusted, not at me, but at her. He said she'd even told him I was her ex who wouldn't move on. I asked if he could prove their relationship. He said he didn't need to. He'd send me a short video she'd recorded from his apartment weeks earlier, smiling into the camera, wearing the same necklace I'd given her for her birthday. The file came through an hour later. I watched it once, then again, forcing myself to stay composed. It wasn't just proof, it was a timeline. The necklace, the furniture, the background, all aligned with her last supposed team retreat. That evening, she texted me a string of messages pretending concern. She asked if I was still angry at Mason for lying. The arrogance of it stunned me. She didn't even know that I'd already spoken to Curtis. She still thought the story was under control. I didn't reply. Instead, I printed the hotel invoices she'd booked under my card and gathered them with the screenshots and video file. I wasn't planning to humiliate her publicly yet, but I wanted an escape plan, a clean one. 2 days later, Mason called to say she'd been trying to turn their parents against him again, telling them he'd hacked her accounts, spreading stories that he was jealous of her happiness. He sounded tired but calm. I told him to let her talk. The truth was stronger now. The following morning, she confronted me again. She accused me of believing gossip, said I was destroying the relationship because of Mason's obsession. Then she said something that gave her away completely. She claimed Curtis had been blackmailing her for months. The word choice was wrong. If she hadn't written those messages herself, how would she know he had them? I didn't argue. I told her if that was true, she should report it to the police. She froze for a moment, realizing she'd gone too far. Then she changed tactics again. Tears, apologies, begging for a chance to explain. I told her I needed time and walked out. Later that night, Curtis messaged again. He said Holly had called him after our conversation, screaming that he'd ruined her life, accusing him of betrayal. He blocked her number and forwarded the recording of their last call, just in case I needed it. In that recording, she said she'd fix everything and make Drew believe Mason did it. Hearing my own name in her voice turned everything cold inside me. I spent the next day setting things in motion. I met with the wedding planner, canceled the venue, and redirected the deposit to my savings. Then I called the leasing office and asked to transfer our apartment lease solely into my name. The landlord agreed without issue. Holly had never read the paperwork. She assumed her name was on it. By that evening, I had every piece ready. I didn't plan on a dramatic scene. I just wanted clarity and closure. Mason agreed to help me with the final step. He'd come over the next day for dinner, pretending to smooth things over. When Holly texted that night saying she couldn't believe her brother would try to ruin us again, I smiled for the first time in days. Because this time, she was walking right into it. The calm before a storm can be deceptive. She thought the tension meant reconciliation. But for me, it was the quiet before everything changed. Tomorrow night, I would no longer be her fiancé. She just didn't know yet how publicly that truth would land. The next evening felt strange before it even began. The sky was overcast, the air still and heavy, the kind of atmosphere that makes silence feel sharper. I set the table as if it were any other dinner, plates polished, glasses ready. Holly thought I was doing it to make peace. She didn't realize it was preparation for the moment everything would come apart. Mason arrived on time, dressed casually, carrying a bottle of wine like a peace offering. He looked at me once when she wasn't watching, a silent check that we were really doing this. I nodded slightly. Holly greeted him stiffly, pretending politeness, but there was tension in the air that no amount of fake smiles could dissolve. We sat down. For 10 minutes, conversation limped along awkwardly. Small talk about the engagement, the guest list, and the vineyard where the ceremony was supposed to happen. Mason answered politely, then leaned back in his chair, eyes flicking to me. That was the signal. I stood up, walked to the TV, and pressed play on the USB file I'd connected earlier. The sound came first, Holly's voice, light and playful. Then the image appeared. She was sitting on a couch that wasn't ours, wearing my necklace, holding a glass of wine, her laughter echoing through Curtis's apartment. The silence that followed was suffocating. Mason didn't move. I didn't move. But Holly did. She went pale, then red, then pale again. She jumped up, snatched the remote, and slammed it against the table, trying to turn the screen off. When it didn't respond, she spun toward me with wide eyes and started talking fast, too fast. She said Mason had created the video, said it was deep fake technology, that he'd been stalking her, that he'd manipulated Curtis into framing her. Her voice trembled with rage, not fear. She turned on Mason, shouting that he'd been jealous since childhood, that he'd never achieved anything, and wanted to ruin her life out of spite. Mason sat perfectly still, his phone recording everything from his jacket pocket. He didn't speak until she stopped to catch her breath. Then, calm as ever, he said he had the metadata from the file and Curtis's email confirming it came from him directly. That made her pause. She realized he'd come prepared. Her next move was desperation disguised as indignation. She started accusing me of invading her privacy, saying I'd violated trust by reading her messages. She tried to make me feel guilty for discovering what she'd done. It was almost impressive how quickly she rebuilt her narrative, stone by stone, even as the walls crumbled. I let her finish. Then I told her the wedding was canceled. Every deposit refunded, every vendor notified, every venue released. She blinked as if she hadn't heard right. I told her I'd already transferred the apartment lease into my name and packed her belongings in the guest room. That broke the performance. The moment she realized she had no financial control, her voice cracked into pure panic. She said I couldn't just throw her out, that it wasn't fair after everything she'd given up. I asked what exactly she'd given up, since she'd clearly been keeping all her options open. She tried crying then, real tears this time, not the practiced ones. Mason stood and told her she needed to stop before she said something that could hurt her later. That's when she lost control. She turned on him, screaming that she'd destroy him and make everyone see what he'd done. He didn't flinch. He just looked at me and said, quietly, "Now you see why I waited until I had proof." She stormed out to the balcony, slamming the glass door so hard the wine glasses rattled. I followed but kept my distance. She was pacing, muttering, trying to come up with another angle. When she noticed I was recording on my phone, she froze and demanded I stop. I told her it was for my own safety. That line hit her like a slap. She backed away, realizing I wasn't reacting emotionally anymore. For a long minute, she stood there breathing heavily, eyes darting around the room as if looking for a foothold. Then she tried one last trick. She said she'd been confused, that Curtis had taken advantage of her loneliness when I was working long hours. She said she'd ended it months ago, and that Mason must have found old messages to twist against her. I asked her one simple question. If that were true, why had she been texting Curtis the morning after our engagement party? She froze again. The silence that followed was answer enough. Mason left soon after, saying she needed space to calm down. Before he walked out, he whispered to me that he'd back up all the recordings and emails in case she tried anything later. I thanked him quietly. When he was gone, the apartment felt hollow. Holly sat on the couch, motionless, hands gripping her knees. She wasn't crying anymore. She was thinking. That was worse. I could tell she was recalculating, trying to salvage whatever control she could. Then she said something that almost made me laugh, not out of humor, but disbelief. She said if I truly loved her, I'd delete everything and move on from the mistakes. I asked if that's what she'd told Curtis when she met him behind my back. She didn't answer. When she finally realized I wasn't going to forgive her, her tone changed again. She said I'd regret humiliating her, that no one would believe my side, once she explained how controlling I'd been. She said she'd call the police if I didn't return her laptop and jewelry that night. I told her she could have them all back, just as soon as I got my money from the joint account she'd drained for those trips. Her expression shifted once more, from fury to fear. She hadn't expected me to know about the money. I told her I'd already spoken to the bank and flagged the unauthorized charges. That meant the refunds would come directly to me, and any further withdrawal attempts would trigger an investigation. She stood up, shaking, and said I was ruining her life. I told her calmly that she'd done that herself. When she left the apartment, she slammed the door so hard the frame shuddered. I sat there for a long time afterward, listening to the echoes fade. The next morning, I called Curtis. He confirmed she'd shown up at his apartment around midnight, yelling in the hallway, demanding to know if he'd told me everything. He hadn't opened the door. Security escorted her out after she tried to break in. I told him to keep any recordings or witness statements in case she caused more trouble. That afternoon, she sent me one last text. "You'll regret this. I'll make you wish you'd never met me." I didn't reply. I just forwarded it to Mason and saved it as evidence. 2 days later, Mason called again. Their parents had finally learned the truth after she tried spinning the story about fake screenshots. Mason showed them everything: timestamps, bank records, and the video. They were silent for a long time before their mother said she couldn't believe it, but couldn't deny it either. For the first time in years, Mason wasn't the one being blamed. Meanwhile, I went to the police station to file a report about the credit card misuse. I didn't press for full charges immediately, but I wanted it documented in case she escalated things. The officer I spoke with said my calm approach made the difference, that people often make bad situations worse by losing control. That night, when I came home, the apartment felt lighter. Empty drawers, quiet walls, clean air. The chaos had left, and so had she. I poured a drink, sat on the balcony, and thought about how everything could look normal from the outside. The same balcony lights, same city view, but inside, everything had changed. Mason's warning, the proof, the confrontation, it all lined up like a chain reaction I'd been too blind to see starting. Somewhere across town, Holly was probably spinning another story, another version of herself. But for the first time, I didn't care what she said or who believed her. She wanted control. Instead, she gave me closure. The week after the confrontation was a blur of silence and paperwork. I'd expected chaos, maybe more calls, more threats, but Holly vanished instead. Her belongings were gone by Monday morning. No note, no apology, not even an argument. Just an empty guest room and a faint perfume smell that clung to the curtains. For a few days, it felt surreal. I went to work, came home, ate, slept. I didn't tell my colleagues what had happened. They still thought I was planning a wedding. My inbox was filled with messages from vendors confirming cancellations. Every one of them reminded me how deep she'd woven herself into my life. I had to undo everything piece by piece, like pulling threads out of a tangled fabric that used to be beautiful. Mason called every other day. He was cautious, checking in without pushing. He said their parents were trying to reach me, to clarify things. I told him I didn't need clarification. I needed distance. They believed Holly's version of every story for years, and now they were scrambling to fix their guilt. On Thursday, I got a message from an unknown number. It was Curtis. He said Holly had been contacting him again. New number, new accounts, claiming she was pregnant. He didn't believe her. He sent me screenshots of their exchange. She said the baby was his. Then, when he didn't respond, she said it was mine. Curtis told me he'd already blocked her, but he wanted to warn me in case she tried something similar. I forwarded everything to Mason and to the officer I'd spoken with before. The officer said to keep records of all communication, just in case. That's when I realized how far Holly was willing to go to rewrite the story. She'd moved from lies to fabrication, hoping someone would panic. Later that week, I learned from Mason that she'd lost her job. Her employer had discovered she'd been using the company card for client meetings that didn't exist. Apparently, Curtis wasn't the only one she'd crossed. When the firm started auditing expenses, the pattern surfaced fast. She was fired quietly, no public scandal, just a notice of termination. For a moment, I thought that was the end. But Holly wasn't done. Saturday afternoon, I was at home when my phone rang. It was Mason again, his voice tight. He said she'd shown up at their parents' house, demanding money, screaming that we'd ruined her. She told them she was homeless because I'd stolen her savings. Mason said he'd tried to reason with her, but she'd broken a picture frame and stormed out. Their parents finally realized the extent of her spiral. He said their mother was crying, their father furious, not at me, but at what Holly had become. That night, I received an email from a mutual friend who worked at the vineyard where our engagement party had been held. She said Holly had shown up there too, drunk, asking for the deposit refund in cash. She'd claimed the account had technical issues. The staff called security when she started shouting. It was like watching the fallout of a storm I hadn't caused, but still had to clean up after. I didn't enjoy it. There was no satisfaction, no revenge fantasy, just a sense of inevitability. This was what happened when lies caught up faster than you could spin new ones. A few days later, I got a letter from the bank confirming the refund of the unauthorized transactions. Over $3,000 returned to my account. Seeing that number felt strange. It wasn't about the money. It was about closure in numbers and paperwork. Proof that I'd survived the damage she'd left behind. I started taking walks after work again. Simple routines felt like rebuilding. Mason joined me a few times. He was quieter than usual, maybe processing his own guilt. He admitted he'd known something was off with Holly for years, but didn't think it was this deep. He told me she'd always had a way of turning truth into something usable, bending it until people gave up trying to correct her. 2 weeks passed. Then came the final twist. Curtis called me. Not texted, called. His voice was nervous, hesitant. He said Holly had reached out again, this time pretending to be someone else, a woman named Mira, who wanted to warn him about Drew. She'd sent him cropped photos from our engagement party, edited to look incriminating, as if I'd cheated first. He'd traced the IP from one of the emails. It matched the same city she was last known to be in. She was trying to flip the narrative again, even now, with both of us fully aware of the truth. Curtis said he was done, fully blocking her. He just wanted to let me know before she tried something else. He also told me he was leaving his job and moving out of state to start fresh. He sounded sincere. I respected him for being direct. He'd been deceived just as deeply as I had, and unlike her, he owned it. That call ended any lingering sense of unfinished business. I deleted her number, archived the police case, and moved on. Months later, in early spring, I ran into her by accident. I was walking to a coffee shop downtown when I saw her behind the counter, wearing an apron with the cafe's logo. She noticed me the second I entered, but didn't say a word. She froze mid-step, holding a tray, eyes wide. Her hair was shorter, her face thinner. She looked like someone who had run out of versions of herself to perform. I didn't speak either. I just nodded politely and ordered my drink from another barista. When it was ready, I turned to leave. As I walked out, Mason's words from that night replayed in my mind. Now you see why I waited until I had proof. She'd built her world on pretending, and every lie she'd told had cost her a piece of stability. Now, she was just another stranger in a cafe. A month later, Mason invited me to a small family gathering at his apartment. He said their parents wanted to apologize. I went, not because I needed an apology, but because I wanted to close that chapter properly. They looked older, quieter. His mother said she'd believed Holly for too long, that she thought protecting her was love. His father said he'd been proud of her confidence, but never realized how manipulative it was. They thanked me for not retaliating or embarrassing her publicly. I told them I didn't need to. She'd done that herself. After dinner, Mason and I stepped onto the balcony. He told me Holly had moved out of state. She was living with a cousin, trying to find work, but her reputation had followed her. Every company she applied to called for references, and the trail of her past jobs told its own story. I asked if he thought she'd ever change. Mason sighed and said, "She doesn't know who she is without someone to lie to." That line stayed with me. A year later, I was in a different city, new job, new apartment. Life had quietly stitched itself back together. Every now and then, I get a friend request from a name I didn't recognize, always with a blank profile picture. I never accepted. I didn't need to know if it was her. The past was like an echo, only loud if you turned to listen. Sometimes, when people at work talk about their partners or show engagement rings, I feel that brief sting of memory. But it fades fast. The lesson wasn't bitterness, it was clarity. Trust isn't about faith, it's about consistency. And once someone shows you who they are when no one's watching, there's no one seeing it. Mason and I still talk. He's dating someone new now, healthier this time, honest. We joke sometimes that we both got lucky in different ways. He got a brother-in-law he didn't expect, and I got a warning I almost ignored. When I think of Holly now, I don't feel anger or pity. I just think of that night on the terrace when Mason said I deserved to know who she was really texting. He wasn't saving me from heartbreak. He was saving me from the slow decay of living beside a lie. And in the end, that was the only kind of love worth keeping. The kind that tells you the truth, even when it hurts.